Welcome back. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejecting President Biden's warning about invading the southern Gaza city of Rafah. Netanyahu says he's standing by his attack plans and telling Israel's parliament in order to fully take out Hamas, they must enter Rafah. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer once again attacking Netanyahu, claiming he will prevent elections in Israel, also warning Bibi's leadership will turn Israel into a pariah. Joining me now is West Virginia Senator Shelley Moore Capito, a member of the Senate Appropriations, Commerce and Transportation Committees. She's also the ranking member of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Senator, it's great to see you this morning. Thanks very much for being here. I mean, how does one look at this? I want to get your take on basically attacking the Prime Minister of Israel in public in the middle of arguably the war of his life. I mean, they are trying to survive an attack on the country, and now Bibi Netanyahu has to defend himself from Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden.
Well, I was astounded when Leader Schumer made his speech last week. I mean, Israel is a sovereign democracy. They should be determining when and how to move forward with elections. They should be determining who their leader is. And we know Netanyahu to be a strong leader, that in times such as this, very trying times, he has the strength to make the decisions in the best interests of the Israelis. And so I think we ought to respect that. If the shoe was on the other foot and somebody was telling us when to have our elections and who to elect, we would say election interference, that's improper, and we shouldn't be, and they shouldn't be doing that. And I think this holds true in this case as well. And so yeah. I can't believe that Schumer's doubling down now, because I think he's been soundly criticized, in my opinion.
Yes, he certainly has, and criticized from Bibi Netanyahu himself, who appeared on Fox News over the weekend, to basically said Rafah is where Hamas is right now. So if we're going to finish the job, we have to go where Hamas leadership is, and we know that they're in Rafah. So what is President Biden talking about, saying don't go into Rafah and do a ceasefire right now, when the Israelis say they know exactly where the Hamas officials are?
Well, I think what President Biden is doing is what he always does. He's listening to the political left in his party, who are saying that they want to have a ceasefire, they want it to stop, and they don't want Israel to complete the job. But let's be, what kills me in this whole argument is nobody ever goes back to what happened on October the 7th. And if you were living in Israel and you saw and heard what happened there, why would you not want to eliminate the forces that were so brutally attacking the Israelis? And that's what they have to do in Rafah. I'm sure they will give warning. I'm sure they will do it as carefully and as strategically as they possibly can. But let's remember, Hamas shields themselves behind innocent people in tunnels under hospitals, under schools. And if they're not eliminated now, they will come back, because it's in their constitution to want to destroy the state of Israel.
And by the way, we have not heard any officials or leadership of Hamas talk about releasing hostages. So all of this conversation about ceasefire, don't go into Rafah, comes at a time when they're not making any promises at all. Here's Bibi Netanyahu on Fox News on Sunday. Watch.
I think Schumer's statements are wholly inappropriate. I think we're not a banana republic. The people of Israel will choose when they'll have elections, who they elect, and it's not something that will be foisted upon us.
And, of course, he is sticking to that this morning. But I want to move on to some domestic issues, Senator. The Environmental Protection Agency expected to announce new guidelines today requiring car manufacturers to produce electric vehicles beginning in 2027. This push will also target gas-powered vehicle emissions. I know you're saying this all about Biden trying to control what type of cars Americans will buy. And the issue that I'm really battling with is the fact that it's not even resonating. Americans don't want these cars.
No, I mean, the ownership of these cars, or people buying them, more expensive. They don't work in certain environments. I mean, I'm from West Virginia. I'm not driving an electric car in the hills of West Virginia in the middle of the winter. That is a recipe for disaster. And I think also these are unrealistic goals that supposedly we're going to have over 60% ownership by 2032. We're now telling the consumer what to buy. The electric grid will falter under the demands of these electric vehicles. And you know, there's other issues associated with them. The weight of the car. How does this perform on the highway in terms of guardrails and other issues? So there's a whole host of issues, not the least of which the consumer can't afford them, doesn't want them, and they don't fit the patterns of many consumers across the country.
Senator, let me get your take on the business at hand. It feels like we've got, 290 days, and one Speaker of the House later, we're back to where we started. You've got another deadline coming up this Friday or Saturday at 12:01. What will get done? Will the $90 billion security supplemental package have a path, or are you do you have confidence that these remaining appropriations bills will be passed?
Well, in the short term, I do believe the remaining appropriations bills will get passed. Now, whether they're passed the deadline, maybe onto Sunday, it appears now that the actual text of the bill won't be coming out until tomorrow. That pushes us back. You know, there's no way to govern absolutely up to the end every single time threatening of a government shutdown. But I do believe the appropriations bills will get passed, and we will move on from that. In terms of the supplemental, there's a lot of talk, I think, on the House side in terms of what we should be doing in terms of support for Ukraine. I think there's talk of maybe a lend-lease or a long-term rent or a long-term lease and purchase kind of an agreement to be able to get the help to Ukraine that they need. It also to be able to refurbish our own stockpiles. This is lost in this argument. The great majority of this money actually stays on shore here, and we use this to manufacture and replenish our own supplies, and that's absolutely critical.
Well, it's a good point to make, because President Biden, I think, just showed us what a potential additional Democrat-led 4 years would look like when he came out with his budget. $5.5 trillion of new taxes and a military budget, defense budget, actually a decline when you consider where we are on inflation. So is that what a Biden next term would look like? $5.5 trillion of new taxes, a declining military budget, and a wide open border? You still have yet to make a difference, the Republicans, in terms of securing the border.
Well, I think that will be part of the discussion, I think, as we move through these appropriations bills. I think it's important to note that the bills that we're going to be passing in the next several days does have a bump in defense and a cut in domestic spending. And so, you know, we are moving in the right direction ever so slowly and slightly in terms of spending. But I think also that we can't take another 4 years of this. I mean, I'm over on Environment and Public Works every day. It's a new rule. It's a new regulation. Right. It stymies innovation. It stymies manufacturing. It doesn't have a gradual transition into renewables. It stresses the grid. I mean, I could go on and on here on why this administration needs to stop.
Well, it's a good point, because now I saw a story yesterday that the Securities and Exchange Commission is being sued. And they've got all these lawsuits from businesses because they can't handle all these new laws. Around ESG and laws around the climate change agenda. Real quick before you go, Senator, got to ask you about Tik Tok. The Senate Intelligence and Commerce Committees will be briefed by officials from the FBI, the DOJ, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on the Tik Tok threat later this morning. The Senate apparently still weighing whether or not to take up this bill that passed the House last week. It would force ByteDance to divest Tik Tok or risk being banned from the United States App Store. Senator, is this ever going to come to the floor in the Senate?
I certainly hope so. With the overwhelming vote in the House, I think it needs to come. I am in favor of this. I think it's a national security issue. We have 11-year-olds calling our office because TikTok has informed them of who their senator is. So if you're going to tell me that they don't have the data to push their political agenda and other agendas in China, I think that presents a danger to us. So divesting is what we need to do, and I think we'll have a chance to vote on it.
Well, when you say 11-year-olds calling the Senate, recently, wasn't there a TikTok influencer at the White House, and the TikTok influencer met with John Podesta to talk about...
Apparently.
Yeah, what happened?
I don't know. The TikTok influencer world is sort of lost on me, but I do know what happens, and you can see this through these calls and other things, what happens when a nation, a communist nation, has your data, how they can push their own agenda, even through, younger people who are making these phone calls. I think it's a great illustration of why we need to do this.
Yeah, I'm just not sure if Biden is looking at the national security issues or if Biden Biden is looking at the political votes, because this influencer, I'm told, went to the White House and met with John Podesta and told John Podesta, we will not vote for Biden unless he doubles down on more climate change agenda. And yeah, he wants that vote.
Oh, everything he's doing is political. I mean, let's look at the things we just talked about. Israel, this TikTok, the influencer there. I mean, it's all done through the, he's going to be in Texas and the southern parts of the states. Obviously, everything is through a political lens, and it's not a good look for the country.
We'll have to get used to that in this election year. Senator, good to see you. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Nice
we
to see you,
appreciate your
Maria.
time.